There's a quote attributed to the 17th century mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal. "If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." Basically, the man was poking fun at the idea that brevity is desirable in writing, while at the same time pointing out the paradoxical fact that it strangely takes more time and effort to convey complex ideas concisely. This same can apply to storytelling, although not as absolutely. One only needs to look at the florid verbosity of H.P. Lovecraft, contrasting with the terse and direct style of Robert E. Howard, both men now iconic writers in their respective fields, to prove that it's not so much the length of the story as how well paced it is. So long as you can consistently maintain the interest of the reader, your story could be as thin as a magazine or as thick as a phone book. That said, Pascal is correct in saying that it is quite impressive if someone can convey ideas in a very short amount of time. And if ever there was a Star Wars comic that impressed me with how much it did with so little page space, it's Dark Lord's Conscience. Published in April of 1982 in The Empire Strikes Back Monthly, a Marvel Star Wars anthology published in the UK, written by no less a personage than Alan Moore. Say what you will about Moore, whether it's his grumpiness, his disdain for people who like Rorschach from The Watchmen, or his hippie edgelord snake religion, this is a man who, when he puts his mind to it, is a dab hand with a pen, as some British would say. Alas, Moore is the only real name of note associated with this comic. The other participants have no significant credits that I could find, and it has no cover art or cover artist, as The Empire Strikes Back Weekly was an anthology. The only other detail that I could find is that this was originally in black and white, but later reprinted and colorized under Dark Horse, as part of a collection called Classic Star Wars Devil Worlds. At any rate, we begin on a literal dark and stormy night on a planet called Chirrit, with Darth Vader playing some kind of strategy game against some squid alien called Lady Dole. The game is called Firepath, and the pieces kind of resemble chess pieces, but instead of squares, it's circles, and apparently if you can maneuver your enemy's pieces onto certain circles, you can activate a fire trap that destroys the piece. Obviously, this is the only story in which this game called Firepath exists, so obviously it's not gone into much detail here. Evidently, Vader is an avid player of the game and has sparred with Lady Dole before, but the Dark Lord has not come to Chirrit simply for the pleasure of a good game. According to Vader, some organization known as the Guild of Vindicators seeks to destroy him. Vader, never the most passive of characters, has chosen to meet these enemies on their own ground, as Chirrit is apparently their home base. We're barely past the first page and already Moore has crammed in a lot of pertinent information. We know the setting, we know Vader's objective, and his exchange with Lady Dole demonstrates Vader's cunning and his supreme confidence. After all, this is the guy who said that the Death Star's power to destroy a planet was insignificant next to the power of the Force. Compared to a superweapon the size of a small moon, what threat could some guild of fanatics possibly pose to him, the second most powerful Force user in the entire galaxy? At any rate, while Vader and his gracious host enjoy their game of wits, the Sith Lord has brought a detail of stormtroopers with him, and a few poor sods drew the short straw and have to actually stand outside in the darkness and rain. The soldiers are griping among themselves, as soldiers throughout creation inevitably do when given such an onerous and dull duty, when out of the darkness emerges a sinister figure who turns out to be the principal antagonist of this story, Clat the Shamer. Described in the narration as a mutant empath, Clat's special power is to reach into the minds of men and flood them with the memories of their own evil deeds. This is the power of the Guild of Vindicators. They cause their victims to be judged by their own sins. In this case, he drives the stormtroopers to kill themselves. Each in turn, he forces them to remember their many victims, the fear, the suffering, the evil that they've inflicted on others until it's simply too much and they can't take it anymore. Here we come to what I consider to be both the best aspect of Dark Lord's Conscience and the worst aspect of Dark Lord's Conscience, though worst might be putting it a little strongly. The sole criticism that I have of this story is that in some instances I feel that the omniscient narration text is completely unnecessary. The art by John Stokes, who also contributed regularly to the Empire Strikes Back Weekly, is, in my opinion, strong enough to convey what's going on so that the narration is superfluous. The narration doesn't interfere with the story, it's just that there are some parts where I think it would have been better if the narration was omitted and John Stokes' art allowed to tell the story by itself. Now for the thing about this comic that I really like. Clat and the Vindicators are never described as such, but this is clearly a form of Force sensitivity, and it's a tradition that is different from that of the Jedi and the Sith. It's heavily implied that this empath ability is the sole skill of the Vindicators, and in some ways they function as a combination of monks and the Psi judges from Judge Dredd, which is appropriate given that this is from a British comic. One particular aspect of the Star Wars universe that I always felt has been underexplored or underutilized is the idea of different takes on the Force. Even when people like George Lucas tried to redefine the Force with the midichlorians, or Filoni with those weird space gods in the Mortis arc from the Clone Wars, the Force in Star Wars has almost always been perceived in the dichotomy of Jedi and Sith, which, especially if you compare their respective codes, are simply inverted sides of the same coin. Similar powers and similar perspectives, just used towards different ends. The Jedi for knowledge and defense, the Sith for power and domination. It's one reason why I always thought the concept of the Grey Jedi was silly and irrelevant, but that's an argument for another time. You see, back in the good old days, before people tried to over-explain how the Force works, it was that very vagueness of its first description by Obi-Wan that gave it its mystique and its appeal.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. Remember, a Jedi can feel the Force flowing through him.
You mean it controls your actions?
Partially, but it also obeys your commands.
From this basis, it's easy to argue that there are many different ways of viewing the Force. And yet this particular avenue has almost never been explored. Now, I don't know if Moore intended the Vindicators to be a Force tradition distinct from the Jedi-Sith dichotomy. Certainly there's nothing in the text that supports this claim, but it would be really cool if it was. And I always appreciate storytellers that attempt different takes on the Force. Famously, David Wolverton created the Witches of Dathomir, and that's basically just, hey, the Force is space magic, what if we had a faction that really leaned into that? Force powers are basically magic spells, and apart from the Night Sisters clan, most Force witches viewed certain spells as forbidden and evil, black magic in all but name. And while I was not a big fan of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor, I really like Matthew Stover's idea of the Sorcerers of Rand, essentially a nihilistic death cult of Force sensitives who believe that it is the will of the universe that all must end, that the universe wills its own destruction, and so their ultimate goal is to bring about that final end by any means necessary. So an idea like the Guild of Vindicators is fascinating to me. It represents another interesting avenue of exploring how the Force might be used and perceived in the Star Wars galaxy. Say what you will about Alan Moore, but credit where credit is due, this is a really good idea. And so, one by one, Clat kills Vader's stormtrooper escort before finally bursting in on the room where he's playing his game with Lady Dole and pronounces judgment upon the Sith Lord. He works his way into Vader's mind, unleashing all the buried memories of all the atrocities Vader has committed, and tells the Sith Lord, "You know what you must do." It seems to work at first, but then Vader simply activates one of the incineration traps built into the Fire Path game and burns Clat the Shamer to a nice crisp. He then reveals that Lady Dole was in on the Guild of Vindicators' attempt to kill him, and that he was fully aware of this from the start, and then incinerates her as well. 6 pages from start to finish, and it ends with Vader swaggering out of the chamber, thinking that this latest game had a rough start, but a satisfying finish. There's not much else to say about Dark Lord's Conscience. It's a short and sweet story that showcases Vader's badassery, while also throwing in a genuinely interesting concept. Although Clat the Shamer had no real chance of breaking Vader's conviction in himself or the dark side, it would take the faith of his own son to change that. As far as I'm concerned, Dark Lord's conscience is an excellent showcase of less is more and deserving of a canon verdict. Until next time. Whether your taste in fiction runs to young adult mythology, historical fiction, or sci-fi dystopias, you can now purchase any one of them for 15% off on my new website during the holiday season. Enjoy a good read, and Merry Christmas.